Hi, my name is Dr. Rayshawn Ray, aiming to speak truth to power, and this is my daily thought. Trump has been in office for a week. What are the top 7 things that he's done that are going to impact your life? And so, number one on the list, obviously, is his Muslim ban. I mean, he's not calling it a Muslim ban, he's calling it a country specific ban. But if you look at the countries, you see that it's very clear that the countries that were chosen were chosen because they are predominantly Muslim religious countries. What's interesting though is that there are some countries, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, that aren't on the list, even though the people from 9/11 who hijacked the planes and crashed them into the towers and was trying to and actually crashed them into the Pentagon and was trying to hit other places were actually from Saudi Arabia originally. What's interesting there is that it's clear, based on Trump's ABC interview, that what he's actually trying to do is he's trying to acquire more oil, not just for the United States of America, but potentially for himself and the top 1%. So that's the number one thing. I mean, this Muslim ban is a problem. And so not only will it might impact you as it's going along, as he's trying to figure out what he's going to do as it relates to oil, this could also lead to increasing gas prices. So, I mean, we saw that with, in the late 2000s when, basically the things that President Bush had done that Obama was trying to fix with the recession and oil and gas. I mean, it hit an all-time high. I mean, we were living in California paying close to $5 a gallon for gas. Obama has got that back to a very low, a very low price per gallon as it relates to gas. This could easily go up. The second thing that this could do and how it could impact your life is that it could actually lead to Islamic terrorists being even more committed, either people committing to them, but also, I mean, we have to look at the fact that many of the crimes that we focus on were actually done by U.S. citizens. And so, I mean, it becomes very, very interesting when we think about these sort of things and these sort of passages to make people feel good and makes people feel safe. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are safe. Number two, this wall that's going to be in between Mexico and the United States is a great wall. Let me tell you how it can impact you. Well, first, Mexico has already said they're not going to pay for it. Trump says they're going to pay for it eventually. We might pay for it now, and you're going to actually pay for it in your pocket. How is that going to be the case? Well, I mean, if he puts a tariff on products coming into the United States, and we get several products from Mexico, and particularly produce, fruit, vegetables, what this is going to mean is that you're going to be paying 20% more for these sort of things. So I mean, so you could go to paying something like $10 for an avocado, or $20 for grapes. I mean, so it's crazy thinking about the price that healthy food might actually cost if this goes through. So these are some of the unintended consequences that we don't necessarily think about when people want this wall. And then we have what's happening with the DAPL, right? This is basically going to be this what's going to be going from the Dakotas all the way across the country, right? This pipeline that's going to be coming across. Even though this is Native American land, and they said that that they didn't want it, there had been a halt put on it. Once President Obama became aware of it, Trump signed that. That is going to continue. So that's a big problem, and this could end up impacting our lives because I mean it could actually make our society less clean, even though, but according to Trump, I mean, climate change doesn't really exist. I mean, how we think about, the environment. I mean, that's not something we should focus on. Which leads me to the fifth thing. I mean, the fourth thing, which is this halting of federal hires and a hiring freeze and a wage freeze. And how does this impact you? Well, it impacts you because, I mean, he essentially put a gag order on everything related to the federal government. So when the U.S. Forest Service put out that there was a huge gap between people who showed up in 2009 and people who showed up for Trump, and don't get me wrong, historians and other people who try to calculate how many people show up to the inaugurations, and they pretty much take the picture from the same place, which is from the Washington Monument. So people who are from DC, who have visited DC, I mean, you have close on this side, you have the U.S. Capitol. That's where where people are taking the oath. And then all the way back here, you have the Washington Monument. And so people take pictures from this way to show the National Mall, to show how many people are there. Because, I mean, close up, these are dignitaries, these are politicians, these are their families. People are going to fill up that space. This is more about who's further back, who, didn't have a ticket to get in, and how do we see that gap. I actually saw a recent report showing that Trump's inauguration might have been definitely in the top 10, maybe even the top 5 most attended. Still wasn't close to President Obama's 2009 inauguration. Regardless of that, why this is important is because it's not about how many people were there. See, he wants us to focus on that. Instead, what this is about the gag order. This is about the reduction of freedom of speech. This is about the reduction of privacy as it relates to a Trump administration. I mean, this is the sort of things that people are worried about. And then the consequences of a federal hiring freeze and stagnant wages. I mean, you could just look at the airport. When you go to airports, I want you to look at how many fewer workers are there. This actually makes us less safe that there are fewer people paying attention to what's going on at airports. The second thing is that, I mean, it's going to actually increase your wait time. So, I mean, start preparing over 2 hours to get through an airport. And these are the sort of things we're seeing where you see one line or two lines going through security and these sort of things. The largest consequence, though, is that people from the State Department who don't agree with Trump actually resigned. I think this is extremely unfortunate. I mean, I get why they resigned, don't get me wrong. But at the same time, we need people from various parts of the political continuum who are part of the federal government. He wants people to resign. Then he can get everybody in there who agrees with everything he wants. And that's going to be even worse. So, I mean, so that's a huge problem. Number 5 is is Trump waging war on inner cities. I mean, he essentially said that being in Chicago is I mean, like worse than being in Afghanistan. I mean, he called it carnage. And what's interesting is when we talk about Chicago, I mean, for people who hadn't really been to Chicago and traveled around, what's interesting is that he's really only talking about the South Side, and parts of the West Side. And I actually know the South Side fairly well. My best friend from college is from Chicago. And so I spent a lot of time in Chicago. And what's interesting about that is when he says he's going to send the feds in, what actually needs to happen is that we actually do something about poor schools. We actually do something about the lack of job opportunities. Dealing with education, equalizing education, and providing more jobs does more to deal with crime than basically any other factor. I mean, law and order simply doesn't work. Stop and frisk was ruled unconstitutional by the New York Supreme Court for a reason. It doesn't work. It's only 2% successful. I don't know anything we find is 2% successful. This is more about the policing of black and brown bodies in those particular communities. And when I hear send the feds in, I hear blowing things up like they did with some of the organization, with an organization in Philadelphia, like the way that they sent in the feds to deal with the Black Panthers and shot all them up in Oakland. So the way that they dealt with Tulsa in the 1900s. So the way that the feds deal with black communities is not positive for us. And so that's how these sort of things are going to affect you. And then if you live in and around Chicago or in Illinois, do you think that what's happening on the South Side and West Side as it relates to the feds coming in aren't going to necessarily affect you? I mean, in Illinois, I mean, they already have sort of a state hiring freeze. I mean, and we're seeing that not just in Illinois, but in Missouri, where people are being laid off by the dozens. I mean, university budgets are being slashed. So that's a problem. All right, moving on. Number 6. These are the biggest ones. And by number 6, I should actually say number 2. So this is like number 2, the second top reason. Essentially what Congress has done and what Trump has provided them a portal to do is to essentially stop allowing for researchers like myself, professors like myself, to collect information on race and class. And I want to read this to you. Essentially what we're talking about is a bill that is being passed in the Department of Housing and Urban Development that's called the Local Zoning Decisions Protection Act of 2017. I'm going to give a shout out to Abraham who let me know about this. And this is what it says. It says the notice of the Department of Housing and Urban Development relating to the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Assessment Tool published in the Federal Registry on December 31st, 2015. That was one of President Obama's acts. I'll get to that in a second about what that is and why it's so consequential. But as it relates to this particular act, it says that it is going to that particular act of Obama's, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Assessment Tool, it says that any successor of this act, meaning anything related to this act, or rules substantially similar to such notice shall have no force or effect. Notwithstanding any other provision of law, no federal funds may be used to design, build, maintain, utilize, or provide access to a federal database of geospatial information on community racial disparities or disparities in access to affordable housing. Now, let me tell you what this Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Act did, or does now, until it actually gets taken out over the next couple of weeks. It's a regulation admitted in July 2015 by the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. That's HUD. That's now what Ben Carson is running under President Barack Obama. Pursuant to the Fair Housing Act, it requires cities and towns which receive federal money to examine their housing patterns and look for racial bias. The intention is to promote racial integration, particularly in cities such as Chicago and Baltimore. So this is an act intended to address what we've been seeing in Chicago and Baltimore, implemented in 2015. Now it's getting rolling. It's the collection of information. It's the collection of facts, which have neighborhoods with a high preponderance of African-American residents. Civil rights groups have hauled the ruling, have basically noted the ruling as being important, while conservatives have declared it social engineering. Now, this is what it's supposed to do. Under the rule, any jurisdiction that receives money from HUD must analyze its housing occupancy by race, class, English proficiency, and other categories. It must then analyze factors which contributes to an imbalance and formulate a plan to remedy the imbalance. The imbalance meaning inequality as it relates to race, class, English proficiency, or other categories. Essentially, social stratification. Now, this is done at both the local and regional level. For example, a major city such as Chicago might analyze racial disparities within Chicago and Chicago suburbs to analyze issues as it relates to housing segregation, issues as it relates to health, and the planning cycle, which will be repeated every 5 years. So they're going to collect information every 5 years intended to reduce racial disparities. In other words, this is to promote racial integration. And then this type of inequality could actually be considered illegal discrimination, and funds will be withheld for communities that do that. I don't see how this isn't a good thing. So preventing us from being able to collect this information, I mean, essentially what this does at this point is it prevents people like me from being able to show that their biases exist. And it also prevents us from being able to show where things are working well. And when things are working well, we actually want to replicate these places. When we see racial integration, when we see people across race and class categories, whether that be people of different racial groups, people of different social class backgrounds, people who are poor, people who are more affluent, when we start to see equality across those divides, these are the things we actually want to replicate. What Congress and Trump has passed or is trying to pass is going to prevent us from being able to do that. That is highly problematic for everything that we do if we can't show the ways that disparities exist in our country. But see, they don't want us to be able to do that because see, the other thing that they did, this is the reason why they had to implement this act, because this was put in place in July 2015. They also actually passed the Midnight Rules Relief Act. This means anything that a president passes in his or her last 6 months, that it can simply be wiped out. I mean, and that's essentially how problematic this is. And so this affects you because you think about what's happened over the past 6 months. All of these things can affect your life if we're unable to collect information in that particular way. The final thing, number one, is actually his war on the press. Why is it his war on the press? Well, it's his war on the press. That's number one, because it distracts us. It distracts us from being able to focus on what we really, really need to focus on. We're caught up in how many people were at the inauguration. We're caught up on these other things. Instead, we actually need to continue to protest, continue to fight, because part of what happens is that we can combat this. And what happens is that when we're in the middle of a social movement, it's a marathon and not a sprint. And you get exhausted when you're running a marathon. Your feet hurt, you're thirsty, your body aches, but you have to keep running. You have to keep moving. And that's what we have to do. So people need to keep protesting in the streets. People need to keep using social media as a medium. People need to keep having conversations because conversations matter. And these are the types of things that we need to do. Final point. This is the things that we're trying to do at the University of Maryland. Some of my colleagues, Dr. Dana Fisher and Don Dow and myself, along with a group of graduate and undergraduate students, collected data at the Women's March. We are actually combating the narrative. What we actually found was that a third of the attendees were first-time protesters, and over 50% it was their first protest in 5 years. They were there for a myriad of reasons, not just including women's rights, but reproductive rights, racial justice, LGBTQ, and the environment. So these sort of things matter. And as always, conversations matter. So I hope that you keep having them.